CLAL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and to present Night Words, a Liturgy on the Holocaust by David Roskies. This recording features CLAL faculty, Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, Dr. Shari Cohen, Rabbi Tzvi Blanchard, Rabbi Daniel Brenner, Rabbi Steve Greenberg, Dr. Michael Gottsagen, and Dr. Robert Rabinowitz, with additional contributions by Eliza Kaplan and cantor Janet Leuchter. To introduce Night Words, here is the author, David Roskies, professor of Jewish literature at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City.
In the Jewish calendar, there is a day for every purpose under heaven, a day for parody and a day for penitence, a day for feasting and a day for fasting, a day for reenacting the Exodus, and a day for reliving the exile. But where in this orchestrated array of catharsis and commemoration is there a day set aside for anger? How can we love God with all our heart and soul without a time for sanctioned rage? Can we rejoice before the Lord, affirm the covenant between the God of Israel and the people of Israel, if we cannot acknowledge the broken covenants? A marriage, no matter how solid, cannot be sustained without the ability to express one's disappointment, without a venue for one's sense of betrayal. So too the marriage promulgated at Sinai. At Sinai we received the Torah, the poet Jacob Glatstein reminds us, and in Lublin, in the shadow of the Majdanek death camp, we gave it back. The destruction of European Jewry is the sign of God's betrayal of Israel. Yom HaShoah marks the day of broken covenants. It is the day of sanctioned rage against God. A day, but not every day. Rather than allow the Holocaust to become the crucible of Jewish culture, rather than turn every day in the calendar into a day of national mourning, it is possible and preferable to make Jewish culture the crucible in which all events, no matter how catastrophic, are reforged. That was the strategy used by some of the rabbis after the Second Temple was destroyed. They found a way of mimicking the sacrilege and channeling Jewish rage back toward the wellsprings of greatest sanctity. They confronted that which was most timeless and sacred with that which was most evil. They did unto the sacred texts that which the enemy had done to us. And out of that brutal juxtaposition of divine promise and historical reality, of prophecy and profanity, a new set of meanings evolved. Night Words is a primer in this art of sacred parody. It brings together the boldest such symbolic inversions from rabbinic, medieval, and modern literary sources. The oldest is this one from Talmud Gittin 56b. Who is like unto thee among the mighty, Elim, O Lord? Psalm 89:9. In the school of Rabbi Ishmael it was taught, who is like unto thee among the silent, Elamim, O Lord? Since God sees the suffering of God's children and remains silent. A word game? Hardly. These words of the rabbis border on blasphemy. They give license to argue with God using God's own words. In the 12th century, in the wake of the Crusades, the poet Isaac Bar Shalom took Rabbi Ishmael's counter-commentary on this passage and created a whole piyut around it. Here, the full weight of medieval Jewry's historical experience was brought to bear upon the covenantal promises made to Israel in the Torah and subsequently broken. In Night Words, Isaac Bar Shalom's "There is none like you among the dumb" is enlisted to form the backbone of the Yizkor service. Only the date was changed to update the charge. Such arguing with God, which the rabbis called chutzpah klapei shmaya, is nowhere more radically expressed than in the book of Job. Job is our first modern, the progenitor of Dmitri Karamazov, of Sholem Aleicham's Tevye, of Kafka's Joseph K. Job brings to mind the personal testimonies in poetry and prose from the Warsaw, Vilna, Lodz, Krakow, Białystok, and Riga ghettos, in which adults protest their innocence and helplessness. Children are wise beyond their years, and freethinkers turn in desperation and hope to God. By using the Amidah as the moment of radical self-confrontation, one can recreate the dialogue of a ghetto Jew caught between a severed past and an unattainable future. Our latter-day Job, however, does not conclude with a voice that answers from the whirlwind. The whirlwind alone is the answer. If the Holocaust represents a new historical archetype, a new order of reality, it must yield its meaning in fierce dialogue with our received texts. One way to measure the awfulness of this event is by the number and diversity of the interpretations that it invokes and engenders. The prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, Mishnahs, Sotah, Kalim, and Brachot, the medieval chronicles, Kierkegaard, Camus, and Kazantzakis. Within their new anthological setting, these disparate texts shed some of their old meanings and gain new ones. The biblical ritual of chalitza begins as a denial of responsibility for one's deceased brother, a denial mysteriously signaled by the removal of one's sandal. It ends with millions of abandoned shoes and no one to establish a name for their murdered owners, except us who have just removed our own shoes. Will we deny these brothers and sisters their names? As the Day of Broken Covenants, Yom HaShoah must stretch the bounds of the fixed liturgy beyond traditional limits and languages. Nightwords introduces Yiddish as a language of public prayer. The 3 Yiddish songs that are woven into the text of Nightwords are all in a minor key, all in the voices of the martyrs. The German of Goethe, Heine, and Rilke is another language spoken by the murdered Jews. German Jewish creativity is here represented by Martin Buber, Nelly Sachs, and Peter Weiss. Despite a desire for inclusivity and innovation, however, I could not bring myself to quote German language texts in their German original. Nightwords is about wrestling with the past, not restitution. Nightwords, which has gone through several revisions, was conceived in a specific place and moment in time. It brings together the theater of the absurd, much in vogue in the late 1960s, and the culture of contemplative prayer as practiced by a generation of young American Jews in Chavarat Shalom Community Seminary. The connection between the 36 speaking roles and the substance of what they say is mostly ironic, in keeping with the conventions of absurdist theater, which questions all notions of authority. Thus, a child is required to say things that no child in the real world ought ever to say. The mute is given some of the most eloquent speaking parts. From the Chavurah's license to experiment, to reinvent Judaism in a more contemporary idiom, come the boldest moments in Nightwords. Hearing the scroll of happenings chanted to the traditional cantillation of the Torah brings home the elemental horror of the atrocities, the more so when their textual source is revealed to be a medieval chronicle. When all the participants are left staring at a mound of their own shoes, those emotional barriers that we inevitably erect when we are forced to grapple with something beyond our comprehension are broken down. But by what authority does one mandate so radical a rite as the ritual of the number, the experiential core of Nightwords? There is none. Some participants will recoil at the colossal chutzpah of having each reader inscribe a number on the arm of the person next in line. What moral presumptuousness to act out becoming an inmate at Auschwitz. There was serious debate about this prior to the first public reading of Night Words at Chavurat Shalom. As fate would have it, the reading was attended by a survivor of Auschwitz with a bona fide number on his arm. He allayed our fears at service's end. Precisely because the burden of the number was only vicarious, he was pleased to have shared it with a group of American-born Jews. Some years later, my colleague Neil Gilman at the Jewish Theological Seminary had the opposite response. He observed that because of the Holocaust, something so benign as counting heads, as when we count the requisite 10 Jews for a quorum, had taken on a sinister resonance. Upon discovering the number still inscribed on his forearm the morning after Yom HaShoah, he could not decide what to do. Does he wash it off or leave it on? As always, the future will decide. One thing is certain, however. Should there ever come a time when the sight of a number branded on human flesh does not strike horror in the heart and does not shake the foundations of one's faith, then at such a time, the memory of the Holocaust will have died, and the memory of Sinai will have been greatly diminished.
And now we present Night Words. The participants, the 36, storyteller, teacher, prophet, historian, rabbi, clerk, dreamer, Abraham, nurse, Isaac, mute, soldier, tailor, mystic, philosopher, investigator, magician, barber, musician, scribe, carpenter, counsel for defense, witness, woman, judge, singer, citizen, chazan, cobbler, doctor, painter, messenger, clown, child, schoolgirl, poet. 1. Kavanah, invocation, storyteller.
In the beginning was the Holocaust. We must therefore begin again. We must create a new Talmud and compile new Midrashim, just as we did after the Churban, the destruction of the Second Temple. We did so then in order to mark the new beginning. Until then, we lived one way. From then on, nothing could be the same.
Teacher.
The ancient formulation has anticipated every single detail of later events. The scriptures are not only a record of the past, but a foreshadowing of what will come. Text and experience are reciprocally enlightening. Even as the immediate event helps make the ancient text intelligible, so in turn the text reveals the significance of the event.
Prophet.
And the Lord will signal to a nation far away
ונשא נס לגויים מרחוק,
and whistle for it from the end of the earth.
ושרק לו מקצה הארץ.
And it comes swiftly, suddenly.
והנה מהרה קל יבוא.
None fainting, none stumbling,
אין עייף ואין כושל בו.
none napping or sleeping,
לא ינום ולא יישן.
not a belt undone,
ולא נפתח אזור חלציו.
not a bootlace broken,
ולא ניתק שרוך נעליו.
arrows sharpened,
אשר חיציו שנונים,
bows all bent,
וכל קשתותיו דרוכות.
horses' hooves as hard as flint,
פרסות סוסיו קצר נחשבו.
wheels like whirlwinds.
וגלגליו כסופה.
Roar it will roar
שאגה לו כלביא.
like the roar of a lion,
ישאג ככפירים וינהום.
seizing its victim
ויאחז טרף ויפליט.
and carrying it off.
ואין מציל.
None shall be left to save.
וינהום עליו ביום ההוא.
His roaring on that day
כן המת ים.
will be like the roar of the sea.
וניבט לארץ.
The land shows nothing but darkness,
והנה חושך.
light blotted out by the clouds of dust.
צר ואור חשך בעריפיה.
Historian.
והיה לפני הגירוש הגדול, and it came to pass before the great deportation. ויקרא אדוני אל בני ישראל ויאמר עליהם, that Adonai summoned the people of Israel and said to them, for 7 weeks or more, the destroyer shall enter the ghetto and smite your homes. There will be blood on the lintels, and blood on the doorposts, and blood on the cobblestones, even unto the Umschlagplatz, the roundup site, and beyond. There will be a loud cry in the ghetto, for there will be no house where there was not someone dead. For 56 days the destroyer, Hamashchit, shall reign supreme. But it shall come to pass on the 57th day that the slaughter shall abate. Then I, Adonai, will speak unto the remnant of Israel, El She'erit Yisrael, and say, Shiv'a ve'esrim yom lechodesh Nisan atzeret ta'asu. Kol melacha kala lo ta'asu ad lemocharat. Yom Evel v'zikaron ta'asu lachem. Ve'asitem lachem avodah chadasha. Ve'higadetem lachem et hadvarim. Ve'amartem et hakinot ha'ele asher itchem po imi hayom. Uve'et bo hashemesh. Ba'asotchem et ha'atzeret. Kol ish b'Yisrael. Anashim, nashim, vataf. Yitz'aku al Adonai. Ushmartem et hadavar hazeh lechok lachem v'livnechem ad olam. On the 27th day of Nisan, you shall hold a solemn assembly. No frivolous work shall be done on that day. You shall observe a day of remembrance and mourning. New rites and rituals shall you fashion, and you shall recite the words and chant the laments from that time and place in which you find yourselves today. And after nightfall, when you hold this solemn assembly, each man, woman, and child shall cry out against Adonai. You shall observe this as an institution for all time, for you and for your descendants. V'haya ki yomru alechem b'nechem, ma ha'avodah hazot lachem? And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say,
It is the ritual of night, in remembrance of that night without beginning or end, for the innocent people of Israel.
Rabbi,
An old Jewish legend has it that there are 36 righteous individuals on earth, unknown to others and themselves unaware of their mission. According to the Babylonian Talmud, the world has not less than 36 pious men who every day see the face of God. They are the vessels into which the suffering of the whole world flows. If even one of them were not here, the world would perish with suffering. They never make themselves known to other people. They appear during great catastrophes, perform their duty, and die.
2. Akedah, the sacrifice, clerk.
Holocaust. 1. A sacrifice wholly consumed by fire, a whole burnt offering. 2a. A complete sacrifice or offering. B. A sacrifice on a large scale.
Dreamer.
Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, Here I am. And he said, Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you.
Abraham.
It was early in the morning. I arose betimes, had the asses saddled, left my tent, and Isaac with me. But Sarah looked out of the window after us until we had passed down the valley, and she could see us no more. We rode in silence for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, I said never a word, but lifted up my eyes and saw Mount Moriah afar off. I left the young men behind and went on alone with Isaac beside me up to the mountain.
Nurse.
Late Saturday evening, we went out into the ghetto and barely made it to the courtyard of Strashuna 14. The courtyard was full of people. It was raining. Everyone was preparing for a journey. We collected our belongings and started moving along the road. At Lukishki, they separated us, my husband and son on the side of the men, I and my 2 daughters among the women. The streets were already filled with thousands upon thousands of Jews who had been brought from the neighboring regions. What would they do with us? No one dared think other than that sooner or later we would return to the ghetto.
But I said to myself, I will not conceal from Isaac whither this course leads him. I stood still laid my hand upon the head of Isaac in benediction, and Isaac bowed to receive the blessing.
Friday at 6 a.m., we passed through a wooded hilly district, Ponar. We used to go here for outings and picnics before the war. We were unloaded in a sandy area among the hills as if on another outing. We heard gunfire not far away. Germans gave the orders, and the Lithuanians carried them out. The Lithuanians started arranging groups of 10. They were led away to the hills, shots were heard, and another group of 10 was taken.
My look was mild, my speech encouraging, but Isaac was unable to understand me. His soul could not be exalted. He embraced my knees. He fell at my feet imploringly. He begged for his young life, for the fair hope of his future. Then I lifted up the boy. I walked with him by his side, and my talk was full of comfort and exhortation. But Isaac could not understand me.
Suddenly, as if by an electric current, the real situation became clear. Women began to plead with the soldiers by giving away watches, by getting undressed. Some fell to their knees and began kissing the boots of the soldiers. Women began to tear their hair from their heads, to rip off their clothes, to no avail. The soldiers took everything away. They teased and joked, and with blows they drove them to the execution. Around 12 noon, when everyone was convinced that his fate was sealed and that no one would leave there alive, then came the change. As soon as their turn arrived, they got into line quietly, without protest or pleas, and set out in families on the last road.
I climbed Mount Moriah, but Isaac understood me not. Then for an instant I turned away from him, and when Isaac again saw my face, it was changed. My glance was wild, my form was horror. I seized Isaac by the throat, threw him to the ground, and said, "Stupid boy, dost thou then suppose that I am thy father? I am an idolater. Dost thou suppose that this is God's bidding? No, it is my desire."
My turn came at 5:30 in the evening. I set out with my daughters. On the way between the hills, we met more groups who, like us, were waiting for their fate. We were placed in a line, and I felt my oldest daughter's hand slipping out of mine.
Isaac trembled and cried out in his terror.
Isaac,
O God in heaven, have compassion upon me. If I have no father upon earth, be thou my father.
mute,
But there was no reply.
soldier,
Abraham shouted, "Have mercy, Lord, do not burn them. Are you not good? Take pity, therefore, on your creatures."
nurse,
And God answered him, I am just. I shall burn them all.
tailor,
Ask now and see. Was there ever such a Holocaust as this since the days of Adam? When were there ever 1,000 and 100 sacrifices in one day, each one of them like the Akedah of Isaac, son of Abraham? Once, at the Akedah on Mount Moriah, Adonai shook the world to its base.
3. Matan Torah, illumination, mystic,
When the ram's horn sounds a long blast on Mount Sinai, that is the horn of the ram substituted for Isaac.
philosopher,
The Rav Chisda, the Rabbah, Berei, the Rav Huna, the Amri Tarvaihu. My Har Sinai, Har Sheyarda Sinah, the Umot Ha'olam Alav. Rabbi Chisda said, "What is the meaning of Mount Sinai? It is the mountain from which there descended hatred, sin'ah, toward idolaters." What does this mean? That the hatred for our people stems from Sinai.
investigator,
Vayhi vaderech b'malon, vayivkeshehu Adonai vayivkesh hamito. And it came to pass by the way in the inn that Adonai met Moses and sought to kill him. Perhaps this means that God suffers gusts of murderous exasperation at the Jews towards a people who have made him a responsible party to history and to the grit of man's condition. He may not have wished to be involved. The people may have chosen him in the oasis at Kadesh and thrust upon him the labors of justice and righteous anger. It may have been the Jew who caught him by the skirt, insisting on contract and dialogue, perhaps before either God or living man was ready for proximity.
magician,
V'haya ba'avor kvodi v'samticha b'nikrat hatzur, v'sakoti chapi alecha ad ovri, v'hasiroti et kapi, v'ra'ita et achorai, ufanai lo yerau. And it shall come to pass, while my glory passeth by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and will cover thee with my hand while I pass by. And I will take away my hand, and thou shalt see my back, but my face shall not be seen. This may be the decisive clue. God can turn his back. There may be minutes or millennia. Is our time his? In which he does not see man, in which he is looking the other way. Why? Perhaps because through some minute, hideous error of design, the universe is too large for his surveillance. Because somewhere there is a millionth of an inch, it need not be more, out of his line of sight. So he must turn to look there also. When God's back is towards man, history is Auschwitz.
Barber.
The heavens belong to Adonai, but the earth he gave over to man.
Musician.
And so the bird of heaven, with archangelic shrieks, and his imperial beak thrust upwards, and his whole captive form folded in the flag of Ahab, went down with his ship, which, like Satan, would not sink to hell till she had dragged a living part of heaven along with her.
Barber.
Lo hametim yahallelujah, v'lo kol yordei duma. The dead cannot praise Adonai, nor any who go down into silence.
Scribe.
We accepted the Torah on Sinai, and in Lublin we gave it back. The dead don't praise God. The Torah was given for life. And just as we all stood together at the giving of the Torah, so indeed did we all die in Lublin.
Teacher.
Rabbah said, to those who go to the right, the Torah is the medicine of life. To those who go to the left, it is a deadly poison.
Carpenter.
And God said to Moses, Ve'asita et hakrashim lamishkan atzei shitim omdim. Eser amot orech hakaresh. Ve'ama v'chatzi ha'ama rochav hakarash ha'echad. Ve'asita et hakrashim lamishkan. Esrim karesh lifa'at negba temana. Uletzela hamishkan hashenit lifa'at safon esrim karesh. Uliyarkitei hamishkan yama ta'aseh shisha krashim. Ushne krashim ta'aseh l'mikzoot hamishkan beyarchatayim. You shall make the planks of the tabernacle of acacia wood, upright. The length of each plank a cubit and a half. Of the planks of the tabernacle, make 20 planks on the south side, and for the other side wall of the tabernacle, on the north side, 20 planks. And for the rear of the tabernacle to the west, make 6 planks, and make 2 planks for the corners of the tabernacle at the rear.
Counsel for the defense.
Can you give us a description of the platform?
Witness.
The platform was behind the entrance gates. To the right of the platform was the men's camp. To the left, the women's camp. At the end of the ramp, right and left, the new crematoriums, numbered 2 and 3. At the switch, the trains were usually shunted onto the track to the right.
How long was the platform?
About 850 yards long.
How long were the trains?
They usually took up about 2/3 of the platform.
Where were the selections carried out?
In the middle of the platform.
Where did the people line up?
At both ends of the platform.
How wide was the platform?
About 30 feet wide.
Woman.
Before them stood a beautiful stone structure trimmed with wood, built in the style of an ancient temple. 5 wide concrete steps led to a low but wide, massive, beautifully ornamented door. At the entrance, there were flowers and potted plants. But all around, one saw hills of freshly raked earth. A huge excavator with steel clamps ejected tons of yellow sandy soil, and the dust it raised stood between the earth and the sun.
Scribe.
לא יקל אדם את ראשו כנגד שער המזרח, שהוא מכוון כנגד בית קודשי הקודשים. לא ייכנס להר הבית במקלו ומנעלו ובפונדתו, ובאבק שעל רגליו. A man should not behave himself in an unseemly fashion while opposite the eastern gate of the temple, since it faces toward the Holy of Holies. He may not enter into the Temple Mount with his staff, or his sandal, or his wallet, or with the dust upon his feet.
Judge.
How big was this room?
Witness.
Smaller than the anteroom, about 30 yards long.
Once they were in, what did they see?
There were concrete walls. In the middle of the room were the pillars, and on each side 2 posts made of perforated sheet iron. There were drains in the floor. This room, too, was brightly lit.
What could be seen through the window in the door?
The people crowded the door and climbed up the pillars. They began to suffocate when the gas was thrown in.
Singer.
Beneath the whiteness of your stars. Beneath the whiteness of your stars, stretch out toward me your white hand. All my words are turned to tears, they yearn to rest within your hand. See, their brilliant light goes darker, in my eyes grown cellar dim, and I lack a quiet corner from which to send them back again. Yet, O Lord, all my desire to leave you with my wealth of tears, in me there burns an urgent fire, and in the fire there burn my days.
Unter deine weiße Stirn streckte mir dein weiße Hand. Meine Werte seinen Tränen willen ruhen in dein Hand. Es dunkelt sehr Finger in mein kellerdicken Blick, und ich hab gar nicht kein Winkel, sei zu schenken dir zurück. Und ich hab gar nicht kein Winkel, sei zu schenken dir zurück. Und ich will doch Gott getreier dir vertreuen mein Vermög, weil es mord in mir auf Feuer und in Feuer meine Tag. Nur in Kehren und Löcher weint die mörderische Ruhe, läuf ich hecher über Dächer, und ich such, wo bist du, wo? Läuf ich hecher über Dächer, und ich such, wo bist du, wo? Nehmen jagen mich schöne Trepp und Häufen mit Geweu. Häng ich angeplatzte Strahlen und ich sing zu dir azoi. Unter deine weiße Stirn streckt mir dein weiße Hand. Meine Wörter seinen Tränen willen ruhen in dein Hand. Meine Wörter seinen Tränen willen ruhen in dein Hand.
Isaac.
There are 10 degrees of holiness. The holiest land in the world is the land of Israel. The walled cities of the land of Israel are still more holy. Of the walled cities, the holiest city is Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, the holiest place is the Temple Mount. The rampart is still more holy. The court of the women is still more holy. The court of the Israelites is still more holy. The court of the priests is still more holy. Between the porch and the altar is still more holy. The sanctuary is still more holy, for none may enter therein with hands and feet unwashed. The Holy of Holies is still more holy, for none may enter therein except the high priest on the Day of Atonement at the time of the temple service.
Citizen.
And it came to pass, when the priests had come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of Adonai, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of Adonai filled the house of Adonai. Vayihi b'tzeit hakohanim min hakodesh, v'ha'anan malei et beit Adonai, v'lo yochlu hakohanim la'amod mipnei ha'anan, ki malei chvod Adonai et beit Adonai.
4. Chalitza, ritual of the shoes. The ushers take all the shoes belonging to the participants and throw them into a pile at the center of the circle. Chazan.
And he said, "Do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground." Vayomer, Al tikrav halom, shal na'alecha me'al raglecha, ki hamakom asher ata omed alav admat kodesh hu.
Cobbler.
But if the man does not want to marry the widow of the war, she shall appear before the elders in court and declare,
Woman.
Me'en yivami lehakim leachiv shem b'Yisrael, lo ava yabmi. There is a man who refuses to establish a name in Israel for his people. He will not perform his duty.
The elders of his town shall then summon him and talk to him. If he insists, saying, I do not choose to marry her, the widow of the war shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and make this declaration.
Chacha ye'aseh la'ish asher lo yivneh et beit achiv. Thus shall be done to the man who will not build up the house of his people.
This ceremony is known as chalitza.
Doctor.
Women and children are to take their shoes off at the entrance of the barracks. The stockings are to be put into the shoes. The children's socks are to be placed in the sandals, in the little shoes and slippers. Be neat. And then again, when going to the baths, take along your valuables, documents, money, a towel, and soap. We repeat, when going to the baths, take along your valuables, documents, money, a towel, and soap.
Dreamer.
But who emptied your shoes of sand when you had to get up to die? The sand which Israel gathered, its nomad sand, burning Sinai sand, mingled with throats of nightingales, mingled with wings of butterflies, mingled with the hungry dust of serpents, mingled with all that fell from the wisdom of Solomon, mingled with what is bitter in the mystery of wormwood. O you fingers that emptied the deathly shoes of sand, tomorrow you will be dust in the shoes of those to come.
Mute.
A cartload of shoes.
A wagen sheich.
The wheels hurry onward, onward. What do they carry? They carry a cartload of shivering shoes.
Der Reiter jogen, jogen. Was bringen sie mit sich? Sie bringen mir a Wagen mit zoppendicke Schiech.
The wagon like a canopy in the evening light. The shoes clustered like people in a dance.
Der Wagen wie a Chuppe in aventigen Glanz. Der Schiech, a volle Kuppe wie Menschen in a Tanz.
A wedding? A holiday? Has something blinded my eyes? The shoes, I seem to recognize them.
A Chasne? A Jontif? Sie hat mich wer verblendet? Der Schiech a Säune nannte, auf Sinai ich hab der kennt.
The heels go tapping with a clatter and a din. From our old Vilna streets, they drive us to Berlin.
Es klappen die auf Zassen. Wohin, wohin, wohin? Von alter Wilner Gassen mit treibt uns kein Berlin.
I should not ask, but something tears at my tongue. Shoes, tell me the truth. Where are they? The feet.
Ich darf nicht fragen, wem es, nur se tut den Herz zerriss. Oh, sucht mir Schiech, der Memes. Wo sind sie, die Fies?
The feet from those boots, with buttons like dew. And here, where is the body? And there, where is the bride?
Die Fies von jene Tufel, wie knäpplach, wie toy. Und da, wo ist das Guffel? Und dort, wo ist die Freu?
Where is the child to fill those shoes? Why has the bride gone barefoot?
In Kinderschiech, in alle was seh ich nicht, kein Kind. Was tut nicht on die Kalle, die schichtlicher sind?
Through the slippers and the boots, I see those my mother used to wear. She kept them for the Sabbath, her favorite pair.
Durch Kinderschich und Skrobis, ich erkenn mein Mames Schich. Sie flecht sie bloß auf Shabbos, a roif ziehen auf sich.
And the heels go tapping, with a clatter and a din, from our old Vilna streets. They drive us to Berlin.
Und sie klappen die Aufzassen, wohin, 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 von alter Wilner Gassen, mit treibt uns kein Berlin.
Painter.
It is 20 years now, Father. I have come home. But in the camps, one can look through a huge square window, like an aquarium, upon a room the size of my living room, filled with human hair. Others have shoes or valises made mostly of cardboard, which once contained pills, fresh diapers. This is one of the places never explained.
And he said, "Do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground."
5. Sephirah, ritual of the number. Rabbi.
And you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house, and on your gates. Ukshartam leot al yadecha.
The 36 participants roll up their sleeves. One of the ushers gives a black felt pen to the scribe, who inscribes the number A81173 on the arm of the 35th. The latter, in turn, inscribes the number A81174 on the reader closest to him, and so on. The usher calls out each number as it is written. The reading resumes when the scribe has his number, A81208, inscribed. Clerk.
The entries for March 19, 1945, show that on this day, 203 people were sent to death. They were assigned serial numbers from A81173 to A81376. The names of the dead are carefully listed. The victims are all reported as having died of the same ailment, heart failure. They died at brief intervals. They died in alphabetical order.
Scribe.
When your forms turned to ashes, into the oceans of night where eternity washes life and death into the tides, there rose the numbers, once branded into your arms so none would escape the agony. There rose meteors of numbers, beckoned into the spaces where light years expand like arrows, and the planets are born of the magic substances of pain. Numbers, root and all, plucked out of murderers' brains, and part already of the heavenly cycle's path of blue veins.
Messenger.
And you shall take 2 onyx stones, and grave on them the names of the children of Israel, 6 of their names on one stone, and the names of the 6 that remain on the other stone. And you shall put the 2 stones upon the shoulder pieces of the ephod, to be stones of memorial for the children of Israel. And Aaron shall bear their names before Adonai upon his 2 shoulders for a memorial. And these are the names of the 12 tribes that crossed the desert with Moses: the tribe of Poland, the tribe of Russia, the tribe of Lithuania, the tribe of Romania, the tribe of Czechoslovakia, the tribe of Latvia, the tribe of Yugoslavia, the tribe of Hungary, the tribe of Germany, the tribe of France, the tribe of Holland, and the tribe of Greece.
Taylor.
And Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and tell them to make a yellow star upon their garments throughout their generations, 1 star over their heart, and 1 on their back, of equal size and proportion. And it shall be for you a sign, that you may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of Adonai, and do them. Do not follow your own heart and your own eyes, by which you are seduced, but remember, and do all my commandments, and be holy to your God. I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Ani Adonai Elohechem, asher hotzeti etchem Me'eretz Mitzrayim lehiyot lachem le'Elohim.
Carpenter.
When Rabbi Meir died, there were no more makers of parables. When Ben Zoma died, there were no more expounders. When Rabbi Joshua died, goodness departed from this world. When Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel died, the locusts came and troubles grew. When Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah died, wealth departed from the sages. When Rabbi Akiva died, the glory of the Torah came to an end. Mishemet Rabbi Meir batlu moshlem shalim. Mishemet ben Zoma batlu hadarshanim. Mishemet Rabbi Yehoshua paska tova min ha'olam. Mishemet Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel ba gov'ai v'rabu tzarot. Mishemet Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah pasak ha'osher min ha'chachamim. Mishemet Rabbi Akiva batel kvod haTorah.
Philosopher.
The beggars were rounded up, and there was no further singing in the ghetto. I heard singing only once more after the deportations began, a monotonous melody from the steppes, sung by a 13-year-old beggar girl. Over a period of 2 weeks, she used to creep out of her hiding place in the evening, when the day's roundups were over. Each day, looking thinner and paler, and with an increasingly bright aureole of grief about her head, she took her place at her usual spot, behind a house on Leshno Street, and began the warbling, by whose means she earned her bit of bread.
Men hat herabgeräumt von Gas die Bettlers, und es ist anstummt geworden auf die Ghetto-Gassen jedweder Gesang. Nur einmal hab ich noch gehört singen in der Zeit von der Aussiedlung, a jiddisch Lied, mit a monotonem Stepnigen, gesangen durch a Bettler-Mädele von a Jahr 13. In Meschich von a 2 Wochen pflegt sie noch a Reuskriechen von a Behaltnisch in die Vernachten, wenn die Aktie pflegt sich abstellen. Jede Tag a magerer, a hecherer und blechere mit was amol a größeren Oriol von Treuer herumkloppt. Sie pflegt sich a wegstellen auf ihrer molken Ort, unter a Haus auf Lejno, und trelleren ihre Trellen zu bekommen a Stickele Bräut.
Historian.
Does it matter how they died? Does it matter how they died? By design or by chance? By will or by order? Does it matter how they were killed? With gas? With bullets? With disease? With cold? With heat? With chemicals or fire? With electricity or barbed wire? With whips or clubs or poison? With suffocation or experiment or work or starvation? With cruelty or quickly? With sadism or disgust? With pleasure or with dread? With excess or moderation?
Clown.
Kulam ahuvim, kulam berurim, kulam giborim. They were all of them beloved, all of them pure, all of them strong, all of them holy, and all of them in dread and awe at the will of their master. And all of them opened their mouths in holiness and purity with song and psalm. And they all took upon themselves the yoke of heaven's kingdom, one from the other, and allowed each other to hallow their Creator, with troubled spirits, with stumbling speech, and with no melody at all. They responded together and exclaimed in fright,
O Lord of the universe, it is terrible.
6. Shemot. Recitation of names. The children. Child.
ושמתם את דברי אלה על לבבכם ועל נפשכם, ולימדתם אותם את בניכם לדבר בם, בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall discuss them when you sit in your house and when you walk upon the road, and when you lie down and get up.
Citizen.
And what of them, the little children, the little ones, and those smaller still, who not long ago were to be seen in the arms of their mothers, smiling at a bird or at a sunbeam, prattling at strangers in the streetcar, who still played patty cake or cried giddy up, waving their tiny hands in the air, or called Papa? Oh, unrecognizable world in which these children and their mothers are gone, giddy up.
Und Tage, sehr Gufe, die kleine Kinder, die kleinere und kleinste, solche, was sind noch gesessen auf die Arms von den Mammes, geschmeichelt zu a Sonnenstrahl und zu a Fegele, gemacht a Kuckuck zu unbekannte Menschen in Tramwehen, die was haben noch gepliesket Tassi, gerufen Heita und gewunken mit die kleine Händelach Papa, Pai Pai. Welt der Kente, die Kinderlach in einem mit den Mammes sind weg. Heita.
Schoolgirl.
Who is like unto thee among the mighty, Elim, Adonai? In the school of Rabbi Ishmael it was taught, who is like unto thee among the silent, Elamim, Adonai? Since God sees the suffering of God's children and remains silent.
Poet.
Now we shall recite the names. Blimishi, Toibishi, Rivele, Leenu, Fagenu, Perele,
Limashi, Toibashi, Rivele, Leenu, Fagenu, Perele,
Chatzkele, Motele, Kivele, Hirschele, Leibele, Berele,
Chatzkele, Motele, Kivele, Herschele, Lebele, Berele,
Shayishi, Chayische, Goldische, Mendelech, Gnendelech, Mindelech, Gezeil in der Nacht, in der Schlafloser Nemmen von jüdische Kinderlech, Nemmen von jüdische Kinderlech, Rochlech, Rachelech, Nechelech, Getzelech, Welvelech, Wigdelech, Jankelech, Joinelech, Mechelech. Koppele, wo ist dein Käppele? Wo ist das Licht von dein Egele? Wo ist dein Häntele, Jentele? Wo ist dein Fiesele, Fegele? Nehmen, was das ist geblieben no, de Worele, de Waschele, Chayele, Schmerele, Perele, Serele, Schimmele, Schiele, Scheiele. Wer kann gefinnen jetzt Mäuschelin, Scheulekin, Schmulekin, Scholekin? Gott auf euch sehen nicht, der barmt sich, hat sie geschanken am Malekin.
Limashi, Toibashi, Rivele, Leenu, Fagenu, Perele,
Chatzkele, Motele, Kivele, Herschele, Lebele, Berele.
Heute nicht da mehr die Heschelach, Heschelach, Peschelach, Hinderlach, Klangen, bloß Lied klangen, nehmen von jüdische Kinderlach. Wo ist dein Fiesele, Siesele? Zippele, wo ist dein Zeppele? Reuch bist du, Jenteles Hentele, Asch bist du, Koppeles Keppele. In the sleepless night, I count the names of Jewish children. Koppele, where is your little head? Where is the light of your eye? Jentele, where is your hand and your foot? Fegele. Their names are all that remain. Is there anyone who can still find a Moishele? God did not have mercy upon them and gave them over to Amalek. The Heshelach are no more. Sounds, only the sounds of this poem are left of the names of Jewish children. Zisele, where is your foot? Zippele, where is your braid? Yentele's hand, you've been turned into smoke. Koppel is head, You've been turned into ash.
Doctor.
Trained by hunger, the child always answers, I am eating. Are you coming? I am eating. Are you sleeping? I am eating.
Singer.
Birds are drowsing on the branches. Sleep, my darling child. At your cradle in the field the stranger sits and sings. Once you had another cradle woven out of joy, and your mother, oh, your mother, will never more come by. I saw your father fleeing under the rain of countless stones. Over fields and over valleys flew his orphan cry.
Dremlen Fegel auf die Zweigen, schlaf mein teuer Kind, bei dein Wiegel auf dein Aare sitzt der Fremde und singt, bei dein Wiegel auf dein Aare sitzt der Fremde und singt. Liu, 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 liu. Ist dein Wiegel gestanden, ist geflochten von Glück. Und dein Mame, kommt schon kein Monat zurück. Und dein Mame, kommt schon kein Monat zurück. Liu, 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 liu. Aufgesehen dein Tatenläufen und der Hagel von Stein. Über Felder ist geflogen, sein verjossener Geweih. Über Felder ist geflogen, sein verjossener Geweih. Liu, 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 liu.
7. Amidah, the standing prayer. First prayer. Clown.
The Lord your God, he is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God.
Prophet.
Awesome. Where, then, is the awe, if the enemy desecrated and destroyed his houses of prayer in the tens of thousands?
The Lord your God, he is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty God.
Mighty? When 1 million of his children were fed to the flames? Where was God's might?
The Lord your God, he is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God.
Great? When millions cried out to him and he did not hear?
The Lord your God, he is God of gods and Lord of lords.
Lord? When death had unceasing dominion of the world?
The Lord your God, he is God of gods.
God?
Second prayer. Schoolgirl.
והיו חייך תלויים לך מנגד, ופחדת לילה ויומם, ולא תאמין בחייך. בבוקר תאמר מי ייתן ערב, ובערב תאמר מי ייתן בוקר. מפחד לבבך אשר תפחד, וממראה עיניך אשר תראה. The life you face shall be precarious. You shall be in terror night and day, with no assurance of survival. In the morning you shall say, if only it were evening, and in the evening you shall say, if only it were morning, because of what your heart shall dread and your eyes shall see.
Third prayer. Painter.
But before my weary brain can labor and choose some object, a dark, cloudy autumn night spreads its wings over the ghetto dwellers. With evening comes darkness, and the ghetto then becomes a city of madmen and lunatics. The darkness is double. No light outside for fear of air attack. The gas lamps are not lit. Shop windows are extinguished. Shutters are sealed over doors. Quite simply, as it is written, a darkness that can be touched. Inside the houses there is no spark of light. At midnight the electric current is cut off, and a watery tallow candle that melts and drips when it smells fire replaces it. By the dim light of the candle, the night shadows thicken. You are completely sunk in thoughts and shadows. The silence of the ghetto in the darkness increases the fear of night, full of secrets and hints. In my room there is no living being except the patient with her burning fever and death lying in wait for her. If only it were morning.
Fourth prayer, Mystic.
Lust sich mir zu tun a Tfile. Weiß ich nicht zu wemmen. Der, was hat amol getreist mich, wird sie nicht vernehmen. Weiß ich nicht zu wemmen. Halt sie mich in Klemmen. I think I just thought of a prayer, but I can't imagine who might be there. Sealed in a steel womb, how can I pray? To whom?
Fifth prayer, Dreamer.
Kra na hayesh onecha, ve'el mi mikdoshim tifneh. Go, cry out your rage, but who will answer? Which of the angels would you implore?
Sixth prayer, Storyteller.
Warsaw is depressed and wrapped in deep mourning, but it is no ceremonial mourning, with only the outward trappings, lacking heartfelt grief. On the contrary, if we could, we would weep bitterly, and our cry would rise to the high heavens. Were it not for fear of the evil kingdom, our wailing would burst forth in the dark alleys, and we would cry and weep and wail dreadfully for our calamity, as vast as the sea. But because of the sword, drawn and waiting for our plaint to lop off our heads, our grief does not break out. Our hearts are our graves.
Seventh prayer, Soldier.
Eretz, alte chasidami, val yihi makom zakati. O earth, do not conceal my blood, and may my cry not find a place to rest.
Eighth prayer, Historian.
History will reveal your memory. People of the ghetto, your least utterance will be studied. Your struggle for man's dignity will inspire poems. Your scum and moral degradation will summon and awaken morality. Your murderers will stand in the pillory forever and ever.
Ninth prayer, Child.
Tam v'rasha hu michaleh. The good and the guilty he destroys alike.
10th prayer, Abraham.
My son, you should not regret it that you have been with me in the locked-up streets of the ghetto, Dzika, Stavki, and Mila. My son, you should not regret your crying today. It does not matter that when you look up to the sun, tears come into your eyes. For you will see, my child, you will see, where today there is wailing, and sadness hovers in homes, and the angel of death reigns supreme like a drunken madman, and people in rags, heaps of shattered hopes, cower along old, dark, and smoky walls, and bodies of old men rot away in doorways or on bare floors, covered with newspapers or pieces of stone, and children shiver and whisper, "We are starving," and like rats stir in piles of refuse. And worn-out women hold up their hands, thin as ribbons in their last barren, consumptive prayers, and frost and disease close in on dying eyes that in their last agony crave for a crust of bread. There, my dear, my sunny child, there will yet come that greatest of days, that last, the very last day, and it will be as in a dream.
11th prayer, Woman.
Halayla hahu yikachehu ofel, Al yichad b'mei shana, b'mispar yerachim al yavo. Black take that night. May it not count in the days of the year. May it not come in the round of the months.
12th prayer. Teacher.
I want my little daughter to be remembered. Margalit, 20 months old today, has mastered Yiddish perfectly, speaks a pure Yiddish. At 9 months, began to speak Yiddish clearly. In intelligence, she is on par with 3 or 4-year-old children. I don't want to brag about her. Witnesses to this who tell me about it are the teaching staff of the school at Novolepki 68. I am not sorry about my life and that of my wife, but I am sorry for the gifted little girl. She deserves to be remembered also.
13th prayer. Investigator.
Ah, Brüder meine, hebt auf dem Kopf, dem Sinkendicke wie die Sonne, dem Kranken. Ich will euch sehen in euer Sunke ob, vernehmen meine eigene Gedanken. Verbleibt der Rege nackt, ohne Mist. Nur lehnt sich allein, wie ein Verbrecher, die Äußeres in sein Teutenzahl verkritzt und tracht zu eier Weh, kein Grecher, Ewiger und Hecher?
Brothers, lift your heads, your sick heads sinking like the sun. I want to see you as you sink, hearing at least what I'm thinking. Stay naked for now, stripped of the present. Read yourself as condemned men read scratches in the walls of their cell. Do you think your pain will surmount its moment?
14th prayer. Scribe.
Und jetzt wenn der Schreck von 1000 Jahren hat euch beringelt mit der schwarzen Leuten, verschalten euch zu sein der Letzte da in volksmanöre jahrzeitige Kneuten, wenn jeder ist allein a Dorf, a Stadt, geklebt von Weib und Kindes vergeliefert Punim, sie hat dem Hobens zornde gesagt, der greift Chotsch eire Fußtritt und gelassen dort Simonim.
And when 1,000 years of enmity has walled the light out completely, and cursed you, last generation, wicks in your nation's memorial candles, when each of you is a separate city cemented together out of kith's congealed faces, has destruction's furious violation dared your footsteps to leave traces?
15th prayer. Rabbi.
Chalila li im atzdik etchem, ad egva lo asir tumati mimeni. Never will I call you right, never deny my innocence, until the day I die.
16th prayer. Magician.
Es schreckt mich euer Freischaft noch anhand, noch mehr wie meine letzte 3 Sekunden. Sie wird euch denn hereinlassen, ihr Land, wo Sterne haben Jomtevlich gezünden? Ich hack mein Schalben an a Stein und such in Splitter seinem Trist für euch, die letzte, weil ich bin euch an euch in euer Buch und mein Sohn ist wie eure in Frühling verkretzter.
I fear the freedom you'll find finally more than the 3 seconds I propose for myself. Will you be admitted to that hallowed land where stars ignite lamps on the shelf? I beat my skull on stones to find consolation for you in the fragments, you the last. For I too am a letter in your book. My son too is spring's leprous outcast.
17th prayer. Carpenter.
For there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that the tender branch thereof will not cease. Though the root thereof wax old in the earth, and the stock thereof die in the ground, yet through the scent of water it will bud, and put forth boughs like a plant. But man dieth, and lieth low. Yea, man perisheth, and where is he? כי יש לעץ תקווה, אם יכרת ועוד יחליף, ויונקתו לא תחדל. אם יזקין בארץ שורשו, ובעפר ימות גזעו. מריח מים יפריח, ועסק קציר כמו נטע. וגבר ימות ויחלש, ויגבע אדם ואיו.
18th prayer. Messenger.
May we be the redeemers for all the rest of the Jews in the whole world. I believe in the survival of our people. Jews will not be annihilated. We, the Jews of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, are the scapegoat for all Israel in all the other lands.
Musician.
Tikia, Shvarim Trua, Tikia, Tikia, Shvarim Trua, Tikia, Tikia, Shvarim Trua, Tikia, Tikia, Trua, Tikia, Tikia, Trua, Tikia, Tikia, Trua, Tikia Gidola.
Judge.
If a man does not judge himself, all things judge him, and all things become messengers of God.
Nurse.
O God of compassion, if God weren't so full of compassion, the world could have some of it too. I who gathered flowers at the foot of the mountain, who gazed steadily at all the valleys, who brought fallen bodies down from the hills, can swear that the world is devoid of compassion. El malei rachamim, il malei ha'el malei rachamim, hayu harachamim ba'olam v'lo rak bo, ani shekatapti brachim bahar, v'histakalti el kol ha'amakim, ani sheheveti giviot min ha'givaot, Yodea l'saper sheha'olam reik me'rachamim.
Witness.
The sun rose over a mount of corpses, and one who witnessed it asked, "Are you not ashamed to rise, sun?" He asked and received no reply. For in that moment he said to himself, "Are you not ashamed to live on?" And he sat down opposite the mount, and looked at the bodies as they lay, some face down to the ground, and some face upward to the sun. And again he asked, "Are you not ashamed to look at the sun?" And in that moment he said to himself, "Are you not ashamed to sit while they lie?" And he lay down like one of the dead, face up, and lay this way for hours. While he lay there, a melody rose within him that sang of his own shame. And as the melody began to sing out from within, he stood up and allowed the melody to spread. And the mount of corpses picked up his melody and answered with an echo like a resounding choir.
Philosopher.
I maintain my human contradiction. I establish my lucidity in the midst of what negates it. I exalt man before what crushes him, and my freedom, my revolt, and my passion come together then in that tension, that lucidity, and that vast repetition.
Singer.
Still, still. Let us be still. Graves grow here. Planted by the enemy, they blossom to the sky. All the roads lead to Ponar, and none returns. Somewhere father disappeared with all our joy. Hush, my child, don't weep, my treasure. Tears will do no good. Though our foes see our misfortunes, they are not understood. Rivers open into oceans, prison cells are not a world, but to our sorrow there is no end, there is no light.
Stille Stille Lob in Schweigen vor dem wachsen Dorf. Zum See verpflanzt die Sonne im grünen See zum Blau. Zwien Wegen Zapanar zu, es wird kein Weg zurück, ist der Tote wo verschwunden und mit ihm das Glück. Stiller Kind meins, wein nicht heutzer, selbst nicht kein Gewein. Unser Unglück will soll ihm sei wir nicht verstehen. Sondreges Eulianen, sondwisse solche Zahnen. Neu zu unser Beine, kein bisschen Schein, kein bisschen Schein.
8. Kriya, reading of the scroll. The Chazan enters the center of the circle holding a scroll and sits down. 3 readers are called to say the blessing over the scroll. They are chosen at random by the ushers, preferably not from among the 36. The readers should remain in the center until the scroll has been completed. First reader.
Va'imalta rak ani levadi lahagid lach, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee.
And it came to pass in the days of the great destruction that the army of night passed through the holy congregation of Nemirov. There were 150 men there, and all were killed. And from there the army passed through the holy congregation of Zhitov. There were 200 men there, and all were killed. And from there it passed through the holy congregation of Berdichev. There were 500 men there, and almost all were killed. From there it came to the large city of Constantine. Over 600 very wealthy men lived there. An evil edict was passed against them, and 6,000 men were killed. And the army of night passed through Zhitomir, killing 7,000 men at once. And from there it passed through the holy congregation of Uman, killing all the inhabitants, 10,000 in all, and passed from there to the holy congregation of Kiev, the crown city of the east, and killed 200,000 persons there, and passed from there to the holy congregation of Minsk, killing thousands of men and their families. And the army of night descended upon the holy congregation of Vilna, famous for its learning, and it killed thousands upon thousands in the prolonged night of terror. They died cruel and terrible deaths for the sanctification of the name. Some were skinned alive, and their flesh was thrown to the dogs. Some had their hands and feet chopped off, and their bodies thrown on the highway to be trampled by wagons. and crushed by horses. Some had wounds inflicted upon them and were thrown on the street to die a slow death. Others were buried alive. The enemy slaughtered children in their mothers' arms. They were sliced into pieces like fish. They slashed the bellies of pregnant women, removed their infants, and tossed them in their faces. Some women had their bellies torn open and live cats placed in them. The bellies were then sewn up. Some children were pierced with spears, roasted on the fire, then brought to their mothers to be eaten. And the army of night passed through Lvov and Lublin, through Warsaw and Lodz, Bialystok, Kovno, Krakow, Częstochow, Riga, Vitebsk, Kalisz, Belz, Kotsk, and Tarnopol, Vurka and Ger, Tomashov and Zamość, Mezrich, Kremenets, Brod, Lublin, and there were 3 million men and women and children there, and all were killed.
Second reader.
Va'imalta rak ani levadi lehagid lach.
And I only am escaped alone to tell thee.
But Adonai rained down brimstone and fire upon Sodom and Amorah, coming from Adonai from the heavens. He overturned those cities and all of the plain, all those settled in the cities and the vegetation of the soil. Now his wife gazed behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham looked down upon the face of Sodom and Amorah, and upon the whole face of the plain country, and saw here the dense smoke of the land ascended like the dense smoke of a furnace.
Third reader.
Va'imalta rak ani levadi lahagid lach.
And I only am escaped alone to tell thee.
And it came to pass, when Moshe descended from the mount, that a pillar of fire consumed the tribes of Israel that stood at the foot of the mount, and 6 million of the children of Israel went up in smoke, and all that remained was a pillar of smoke that ascended to the uppermost heaven, and can be seen to this very day. And when Moshe saw that his people had been made into smoke, he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them beneath the mount, and he raised a great and terrible shout. The people, where are the people? The whole world has gone crazy.
Kriya. Ritual of tearing. The Chazan rips a piece of his or her clothing, as is customary when mourning the dead. 9. Hallel. Dreams and nightmares. Dreamer.
It is a dream within a dream, varied in details, one in substance. I am sitting at a table with my family, or with my friends, or at work, or in the green countryside, in short, in a peaceful environment, apparently without tension. Yet I feel a deep and subtle anguish, the definite sensation of an impending threat. And in fact, as the dream proceeds, slowly or brutally, each time in a different way, everything collapses and disintegrates around me, the scenery, the walls, the people, while the anguish becomes more intense and more precise. Now everything has changed to chaos. I am alone in the center of a gray and turbid nothing. And now, I know what this thing means, and I also know that I have always known it. I am in the lager once more, and nothing is true outside the lager. All the rest was a brief pause, a deception of the senses, a dream. My family, nature in flower, my home. Now this inner dream, this dream of peace, is over. And in the outer world, which continues gelled, a well-known voice resounds, a single word, not imperious, but brief and subdued. It is the dawn command at Auschwitz, a foreign word, feared and expected. Get up, stavach.
Chazan, Ribono shel olam, ani shelcha v'chalamotai shelcha. Chalom chalamti, ve'eni yodea mahu. Yehi ratzon milfanecha, Adonai Elohai ve'Elohei avotai, sheyehiyu kol chalamotai alai v'al kol Yisrael l'tova, ben shechalamti al atzmi, uven shechalamti al achirim, uven shechalmu achirim alai. Im tovim hem, chazkem v'amtzem, v'yitkaimu bi uvahem kechalomot shel Yosef HaTzadik, וכשם שהפכת את קללת בלעם הרשע מקללה לברכה, כן תהפוך כל חלומותי עלי ועל כל ישראל לטובה, ותשמרני ותחנני ותתרצני, Amen. Lord of the universe, I am yours, and my dreams are yours. I have dreamt a dream, and I do not know what it is. May it be your will, Lord my God and God of my fathers, to confirm all good dreams concerning myself and all the people of Israel for happiness. May they be fulfilled like the dreams of Joseph. Even as you did turn the curse of Balaam the evil into a blessing, may you turn all my dreams into happiness for myself and for all Israel. Protect me, be gracious to me, and favor me. Amen.
Amen.
Messenger.
Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chavar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. The hand of the Lord held me transported, and spirited my spirit, and set me down in the fell of a valley filled with bones. The Lord caused me to compass the bones in the open valley. They were very dry. And then he addressed me.
Magician.
Ben Adam, hatichjena ha'atzamot ha'ele? You, human, can these bones live?
Lord, I answered, you alone know. And then he addressed me.
Hinave al ha'atzamot ha'ele, ve'amarta alehem, ha'atzamot ha'yiveshot, shimu devar Adonai. Proffer this prophecy over these bones. O dry bones, welcome the word.
Thus spoke my Lord to these bones.
Hine ani mevi bachem ruach v'chayitem, v'natati alechem gidim, v'ha'aleti alechem basar, v'karamti alechem or, v'natati bachem ruach v'chayitem, v'yidatem ki ani Adonai. I will let breath enter in you, and you will live. I will make you muscle and lend you flesh, settle you with skin, bring you breath, and you will live and know your Lord.
So I proffered the prophecy commanded of me, and as I uttered it, a clacking clattered, and bone came bone to bone. And I saw sinews, flesh, skin come up and cover them, but yet no breath. And then he addressed me.
Hinabe el haruach, hinabe ben Adam, v'amarta el haruach, ko amar Adonai Elohim, me'arba ruchot boi haruach, uvechi baharugim ha'ele v'yichyu. Prophet the breath, you human, address the breath. Say, God says, I summon you, breath, from the four quarters to breathe in these slain that they may live.
So I uttered the summons commanded of me, and the breath entered, and then they lived. And then they stood, an immense army, and then he addressed me.
Ben Adam ha'atzamot ha'ele kol beit Yisrael hema, hine omrim yabshu atzmotenu, ve'avda tikvatenu, nigzarnu lanu. You human, these bones are the host of all the chosen. The cry they utter is, our bones are dry, our hope is drained, we are cut off.
Musician.
Bring near the day, which is neither day nor night, Most High. Make known that yours is day and yours is night. Set guards about your city, all the day and all the night. Make light as day, the dark of night. Karev yom mashehu lo yom velo laila. Ram, hoda ki lecha yom maflecha halayla. Shomim mafke li'yocha kol hayom v'chol halayla. Ta'ir ka'or hayom cheshchat layla.
Chazan.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'kedushato shel Aharon, v'tzivanu levarech et amo Yisrael ba'ahava. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with the holiness of Aaron, and commanded us to bless your people Israel with love.
Chazan.
Chadesh,
Renew in us the will to live,
Yamenu,
the dreams of day and not the dreams of night,
Kakedem,
as in the days before the great destruction.
Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Vena Shuva, Vena Shuva, Chadesh, Chadesh, Yameinu Kekedem.
10. Yizkor. Remembrance. Woman.
The solemn moment has arrived when we remember those who are no longer with us. Even those who have finished their prayers come in at this time to be with everyone else as they wait for the words. We recite Yizkor. And he who has survived and lives, and who approaches this place, let him bow his head, and with anguished heart, let him hear those words, and remember his names as I have remembered mine, the names of those who were destroyed. At the end of the prayer, in which everyone inserts the names of members of his family, there is a passage recited for those who have no one to remember them, and who, at various times, have died violent deaths because they were Jews. And it is people like those who are now in the majority.
Poet.
Count by ones to 6 million, a number each second. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You will be here all April, all May, and part of June. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, not even naming names, each person a number. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. The Germans always started over again after 200,000. 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33.
Mute.
There is none like you among the dumb, keeping silence and being still in the face of those who would grieve us. Our foes are many. They rise up against us as they take counsel together to revile us. Where is your king? They taunt us. But we have not forgotten you, nor deceived you. Do not keep silence.
Isaac.
They made ready to slay their children, intending the blessing of sacrifice. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Let us proclaim his unity. For his name's holiness are we slain. Our wives and children are falling by the sword. Do not keep silence.
Child.
As priests for the slaughter of their Holocaust, they bound the children and their mothers, and in the fire they burned their skins, sprinkling the blood of sisters and brothers, offering as sweet savored sacrificial portions the head and severed parts of flesh. Do not keep silence.
Citizen.
A charred and overflowing pile, like an oven both uncovered and unswept. All Israel weeps for the burning. But those falling in God's fire are destined for his initiate's abode, like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Do not keep silence.
Storyteller.
The foe was strutting with his sword, destroyed my precious ones, made them to naught, and he slew all who did my eye delight. The year 1942, when trouble closely followed trouble, and for my feet they set a snare. Do not keep silence.
Doctor.
Make our remnants your own once again. Among crowds, show us your wonders. Establish peace upon us. Pity, O our Holy One, those whom you have dispersed. Let a willing spirit uphold us. Arise for our help and redeem us. Do not keep silence.
Abraham and Isaac.
Do not keep silence.
Do not keep silence.
Mute.
Do not keep silence.
Soldier.
And so it was, when the deluge had passed, that a child stepped out on the breast of the earth. Amidst the rubble and the ruin, it found, scattered in 1,000 pieces, the shards of a stone tablet. With painstaking care, the child pieced the shards together. On the tablet was inscribed,
Mima'amakim karati ya.
Westerbork, Warsaw,
From the depths I have called out to thee.
Vilna, Theresienstadt,
Hallelujah.
Travniki, Treblinka,
Le'olam va'ed.
Stutov, Skaržisko,
Kadosh.
Sobibor, Sachsenhausen,
Kadosh.
Ravensbrück, Pustkov,
Kadosh.
Honar, Plaszow,
Adonai Tzivaot.
Oranienburg, Natzweiler,
Melo chol haaretz kivodo.
Neuengamme, Majdanek,
God's presence fills the earth.
Mauthausen, Lichtenberg, Lida,
Adonai is one.
Lvov, Janovska, Gross-Rosen,
His name is one.
Drancy, Dora, Dachau,
There is none
Chelmna, Buchenwald,
but God
Bergen-Belsen, Belzec,
alone.
Babi Yar, Auschwitz,
Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah. V'yalma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechon u'vyomechon u'b'chayei l'chol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala u'bizman kariv yimru amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevorach v'lam u'omei omaya.
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי תקודשה בריחו לעילם מנחה ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Night Words, the commentary. The conversation that follows is a commentary on Night Words, a liturgy on the Holocaust by David Roskies, professor of Jewish literature at the Jewish Theological Seminary. In all our work, Klal, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, is committed to bringing a multiplicity of perspectives to bear on the evolving story of Jewish life. This tape is one such example of our work. The participants in this commentary are Dr. Shari Cohen, director of Klal's Jewish Public Forum, and the author of the book Politics Without a Past, about the politics of memory and forgetting in post-communist Eastern Europe. Dr. Richard Schechner, professor of performance studies at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, author of many books, including The Future of Ritual and Performance Theory. Dr. Schechner is also an experimental theater director. And Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, the vice president of Klal.
As David Roskies said in his introduction, Night Words is an imitation in the tradition of the early rabbinic creation of rituals and liturgies as they adapted Jewish tradition after the destruction of the Second Temple. Its purpose, according to Roskies, is to channel rage against God while ritualizing a commemoration that includes a very broad range of textual voices, from biblical text to medieval commentary to Holocaust literature, and which includes a broad range of characters. Even more than the Passover Seder, it's a play. I'd like us to think about it in this conversation less from a theological standpoint, less about a conversation with God, and more in two other contexts. First, as a mechanism for creating and perpetuating collective memory of the Holocaust. How does Night Words function as ritual, as theater? And secondly, I want us to talk about Night Words as a ritual that could gain importance in a particular generational and social context in the first decades of the 21st century. One thing I know from my work on the memory of World War II in Eastern Europe is that collective memory does not just happen. It is a move of interpretation from raw experience and family stories to something shared, something that can be passed down to people who did not experience the event and who do not even know anyone who did. Collective memory is shaped, it's acted out, it's debated in particular social and political contexts. Look, for example, right now at the debates about what to do with Lower Manhattan after September 11th. Now, sometimes that process of public interpretation doesn't happen, or it can be repressed, and the experience of a trauma or an event remains raw, as in Eastern Europe under communism. What is so striking about the Roskies piece, and the reason why it's so important that it gets attention now, is because we're at an important generational juncture regarding collective memory of the Holocaust. And I think all of our comments today will come out of that recognition. So in what way is this a new stage? Well, for one thing, the survivors of the Holocaust are dying, and we're right at that point where we're moving from direct experience to collective memory. After a few more years, that transition is going to be complete. And so it's going to mean something different to talk about the Holocaust individually, collectively, as Jews, as Americans, when no one is alive who experienced it, even indirectly. No one is alive who experienced the broader context of World War II, even if they were sitting in New York during the period of 1939 to 45. And this is going to be a process that is similar to the process that happened when people were no longer alive after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, after the Exodus from Egypt, after, in our American context, the American Revolution. So one reason we're at a new stage is because the survivors are dying. Another reason that we're in a new stage is because after a period of public silence really until the 1960s or the late 1960s, the first years after the war, there was very little public discussion about the Holocaust and its meaning, both in the Jewish community and in America more generally. We then moved to a period in the 1970s of almost over-focus on the Holocaust. That was the period out of which the Holocaust Museum in Washington came, all of the Holocaust studies curricula, the chairs in Holocaust studies at universities, the trips for high school students to Auschwitz and then on to Israel. And so we're coming out of a period right now, I would suggest, when all of the institutions were created to memorialize, commemorate, pass on the meaning of the lessons of the Holocaust. We might be moving to a new stage because generationally, people who have no connection to survivors are media savvy in a new way. They don't experience themselves as victims of anything. And they are suspicious of traditional authorities, traditional rituals, institutions of all sorts. So where does night words fit in all of these contexts? And how is night words different from the many other mechanisms of memorialization and commemoration? The Holocaust Museum, for example, history books, even visits to the concentration camps. I started thinking about what's different about it for me, and I think what's moving about it is really that it's to be read and sung aloud. The part of it that actually moved me the most, and maybe I'll leave it to some of the other people in this conversation to talk a little bit more about this, is the part where the Chazan chants the history of this destruction of the Jews of Eastern Europe to the Torah trop, and passed from there to the holy congregation of Minsk, killing thousands of men and their families. And the army of night descended upon the holy congregation of Vilna, famous for its learning. I'll turn it to Richard Schechner to talk about why that might actually move me in ways different from going to a museum.
You're talking about the difference between the archive and the repertory. The museums, for example, are good examples of the archive. And in the museums, in the Holocaust museums, we see actual items from the Holocaust, the eyeglasses, the shoes, the Nazi records of 1,000 people dying of heart failure at the same day, or we see films of the horrendous, quote, medical, quote, experiments. And these are, it's necessary to have this, but quite frankly, after a time, we become deadened to this kind of experience. After you see piles of corpses, emaciated corpses again and again and again, after you walk through and repeat these experiences, you begin to become accustomed to them, and they get archived in your own mind as Holocaust, because also you're not really experiencing them. They're so horrific that one has to maintain a kind of distance from them in order to grasp them. And I'm for this kind of thing for historical and educational reasons, but Night Words does something else again. It embodies an experience that is not the, quote, actual experience, but allows for an empathetic reverberation with the outflow from that experience. And that is exactly what tradition means. Tradition literally means to pass down from one to the other. It's related to the word trade. And so how is an event and its commemoration passed down? And what Night Words does is not tell the story of the Holocaust, but tells the story of the reaction and the embodiment of how the Holocaust will play in each individual participant down through time. So if you leave to the museums, quote, the Holocaust, and you leave to new liturgies like Night Words, and I hope there will be others as well, the embodiment of the experience of having to deal with the archive, then that's something else again. And that's what ritual can do so well, because ritual both brings us into an actual immediacy of the participatory experience and into a chain of historical memory. Now, I would quarrel with you with the notion of collective memory, too close to Jung for me, and collective unconscious. But I would say that shared memory, which is different than collective memory. Collective memory assumes a single memory of which we jump into. Shared memory means that you have one kind of experience, I have another kind of experience, and where do they overlap and where do they diverge? And in the enactment of any kind of literature, we have the divergence. When you, in that, sing the Kaddish, for example, one person will get up and sing the Kaddish for the Shoah, another person will sing it for their mother. And because the Kaddish reverberates that way, it's not about, it's very personal. So that is shared, but not collective.
I can't imagine a better summary of what I think good ritual is when it works. And what's so striking for me about this piece, and why I think for all of us it resonates so powerfully, is because when great ritual works, it seems to me the line between archive and repertory almost vanishes. And you are able to access all of that material, whether it's memory, text, sound, taste, smell, that is from the past. And it is all there as if in an archive, but it's there to be used.
Well, yeah, I think what Nightwords does is triangulate something. The personal experience, the Shoah, and the tradition of Jewish liturgy. The museums do not have the tradition of Jewish liturgy. First of all, they're designed for non-Jews as well as Jews. Nightwords is clearly designed for Jews, and therefore that association, one's own childhood association, so you have a triangulation of the history, the personal experience, and the liturgy itself, which has its own history.
Right, which is critical because so often we get locked in what I think is ultimately a false dichotomy between a commitment to preserving the past as if it's a static object, right, or feeling something in the present. And of course, it seems that we know, and this puts in front of us, and Sherry, that's what you're chanting, even sitting here this morning, did for me sitting and listening to it, is that what is past becomes present. My present all of a sudden is a part of the construction of what is the past. And in doing that, you really live up to the meaning that you've taught us about tradition, that it is the ability to pass on a story that both resonates with the past and has integrity in the present. And any time you can do that, and here Nightwords I think beautifully does, we are doing something that has incredible significance, not just for us individually, but in that shared way.
It embodies things. If I had a criticism of the text, it would be simply, and maybe it's there because I haven't heard it, and I really do best hearing it, that there would be open places for contemporary testimony, so that at a certain point someone can bring in something that's not written at a certain moment or several moments in there, because what it invites you, what good ritual does, is to say, I am present now. Like at the Seder, when you say to that one child, this is what they did for me, and I went forth from Egypt. And of course, we know at one level, the person sitting there didn't go forth from Egypt, but that ritual identification makes it a possibility. And that's what this has to be. Not that I went through the Shoah so much, but I am going through the recollection and the remembering. And remembering is also a very interesting word. It means to put the body back together. Dismembering is to cut it apart. Remembering is to put... So what body is being put back together by liturgies like this? A certain body of Jewish history, an attempt to say that the Shoah perhaps is not a rupture, but needs to be, in a certain sense, reassembled in the context of Jewish history.
Well, I think that what we are doing right now is a form of commentary that is adding in to the spaces that you're sort of asking for in the actual enactment of something like Nightwords. And what's so interesting about this is how it's sort of the raw material from which it's just the very beginning of a ritual which, like the Haggadah, which, like the Seder, will, we can imagine, over the years become quite different from what it is now. At some point, perhaps it'll be canonized in some other form or written down in some other form. But I would imagine, and perhaps Brad can speak a little bit more to this, that
this is a little bit what the raw material of the Haggadah felt like. It felt like there was no, there wasn't a space quite yet.
Before Brad, just one thing. The big difference is that in the Purim Megillah and in the Exodus story, the Jews are triumphant. And we can't blink at the fact that Warsaw Uprising, Danish rescue, whatever, the Jews were not triumphant. The hideous truth is Hitler was successful in making Europe free of Jews. So that we haven't really gotten to. There wasn't the Pillar of Fire. There wasn't the Red Sea. The armies weren't swallowed up. Yes, Hitler was, and the Nazis were defeated by the Allies, but not before this terrible price was paid. Of course, one could say the state of Israel is the Exodus and so on, but that's where later on in the conversation I'd like to talk about the function of parody, the function of rage, because it's not enough to say, because the Haggadah finally is a triumphant narrative.
Right. I think what's critical here, and you're 100% correct, whatever victories were experienced at the end of World War II and the years following, to talk about us, whether that's the Jewish us or the human us, is victorious after Auschwitz, is insane. Exactly. Right? The human loss that requires the remembering of all of those souls, you can't talk about victory. And I think precisely that is why it takes hundreds of years to go through the process and begin to see the horrible episodes of a people's past as the resources with which to rebuild their future. So when we talk about the Haggadah and we talk about the formal ritualization around Passover, the amount of time it took for that to happen was quite significant, right? We inherited a tradition which was one of slaughtering lambs, which was more in the archival method. It was to literally do again what people imagined had been done at the Exodus from Egypt. That was done in the temple at Jerusalem. From the time that temple is destroyed till the first articulations of things that look like our present rituals of Passover Seder is about 100 years. It takes time to be able to play in that way with what have been devastating defeats. But I think haltingly you get there by insisting on the need to do it. And in that way, probably the fixedness of night words, which feels like it's really grounded, meets the initial need of what will we say now. This conversation, Sherry, as you point out, that we felt we had to have as a part of it, which invites conversations in light of this ritual, is as essential. And in the next 50 years, it seems to me we will in fact be able to embrace precisely the kind of grounded formal liturgies that always leave space for people to interpret as they go. And for me, it's just that we're not quite there yet, that takes time. And I think what you said, when you live in a moment when you have kinds of artifacts, when you have film, when you have physical artifacts, it may even take a little bit longer for us to liberate ourselves to be able to play with the experience, in fact, so that it doesn't deaden the experience. It does just the opposite. It becomes more alive to us than ever before.
One of the things I like about Night Words, and I do look at it as a transitional piece, which I'll talk about in a minute, is that it is not a museum, in the sense that museums, even the great interactive museums, still have the quality, again, in collective experience, if you will, of being places for beauty, places for reflection, and places for artworks, so that it's very hard. I think the Holocaust Museum in Washington does very well because it's concrete, it's cement, it takes you down a specific avenue, so it is an anti-museum museum in a certain way. And that is good if it were just the same. But I think what Night Words does is, I would call it a provisional liturgy, a step on the way towards embodiment. And the question then is, can rituals be invented? I think that's a really interesting question. And the answer is, of course they can be invented. They're always being invented. They're being invented on the micro level in our daily routines. And they're being invented, this is a macro level. But we should not think of ritual as something that's frozen, but as something that's malleable, something that emerges. And whenever we study the history of a particular ritual, whether it's the Haggadah ritual or the Roman Catholic Mass, you can identify the historical moments when things are changed. And then the same people that identify that say, well, we can't change these things. And I said, but they changed here, there, and everywhere. So that then the question is, how will this get integrated into the Shabbat service? What will happen at that moment, those different moments? How does it serve as a model for the notion that this enormous rupture in history must now be historicized and ritualized?
No, I think that's it. I think that all ritual is not only invented, but is continuously reinvented.
Exactly.
And the multiplicity of characters and night words, it's so powerful for me because it suggests that that as you go through it, whether as a so-called performer or a so-called audience, and I think the line vanishes because it invites us to locate ourselves. And in some way, for me, that's a model of how we should all approach all ritual in whatever tradition, be it religious or secular, political, that we ourselves are reinventing the traditions that are sacred to us. And in fact, that sacredness is not defined by its untouchability, but just the opposite, by its continual approachability, by the way it invites us to participate and explore and examine ourselves in light of those practices that are important for us.
You know, one of the things that David Roski sets out to do here is to sort of frame night words as a kind of sacred parody in the tradition of the theater of the absurd. And so he has a clown, he has, you know, different characters, he plays around with text in various different ways, departing from the traditional text with word plays and things like this. What I'm really thinking about is, in order for this to feel like it is something that you come to anew each year, if you were to do this year after year after year, I would think that on some level it would be necessary to do it in a lot of different ways, to see the sort of sacred humor in it occasionally. And that's just a really striking thing to me about, I think, good ritual, that it's something that becomes not ritualized to be done only for itself, but it's something that you can stand back from and do in different ways, even with a tragedy as significant as the Holocaust, to laugh a little bit.
Right, but that is the element that in this text, frankly, I don't see as much as I would like to see. In the Native American tradition, there are ritual clowns who do everything backwards and in the midst of the sacred ceremony. And people laugh at these people. And their humor is scatological, and their humor, and one wonders if you come to this suddenly, how can this be sacred? How can this be effective? It is because finally we live a whole life. We don't live, and sometimes when we enact our life, we enact only part of our life. Once we release the chthonic, the deep, the hidden, and the inverted, we can again come to terms with it and grasp it. One could think of the Holocaust itself as an enormous obscenity, which it really is. The notion that mechanization of death, based on genocidal desires fulfilled, but one cannot think it as the product of mad people, but more or less the detritus of a certain phase of Western and European civilization. And there's where parody can, at the same time, explain this to some degree, but undercut it. I mean, I'm thinking of the producers, for example. I'm sure, some people are offended by the producers as they were by the movie. But another time, it's a release, like Chaplin's Great Dictator. So one needs these things as well. To get hold of something, one has to grab it from the bottom as well as honor it from the top.
I think that's both share your question and this response. It's almost ironic, forgive the use of the term, sitting in a studio the day after Purim, a central theme of which is the sacredness of parody and reversal. And ultimately, there will come a time that there will be a humorous side that will emerge, and I think it's just a question of how long you have to wait to get there. I remember the very first time one of my teachers, who is himself a survivor of Auschwitz, talked about the jokes he and the other yeshiva boys told in the camps. And I remember the feeling was almost revulsion. How, Rebbe, could you do that? And I watched his eyes as he talked about the telling of the jokes, and I came to realize The real question is, how could he not? And that for a tradition to be whole, every piece of who we are as human beings has to be admitted. Just as I imagine it was for Purim. I don't imagine that people clowned about the Purim events, to the extent they were historical, the year after they escaped. And there it was victorious. Here we were not victorious. So my guess is we'll take slower and more halting steps, but the thing to be aware of at every step is that all of who we are will ultimately need to be included in any form of ritual that really is going to make it, if it really hopes to remember all of who we were. So it may be just the inclusion of the character of the clown will be one generation's ability. And the next generation will add some kind of little joke that will only be understood by so-called insiders to the experience. And eventually it widens out to the point where you could yesterday walk around New York City and see, people, men dressed in drag in a culture that forbids it, and people who teach that you should blot out Haman's name dressed as Haman. Because eventually, with enough distance, you do bring the whole story inside. Right. And when it's fully inside, the one thing I'm sure can't happen is it can never die.
Right. And we don't know, we're still in the early stages, as you both have noted, of the ramifications of the Shoah. We really don't know how to handle it. And one of the things I liked about Nightwords, when I first received it from you, frankly, I said, oh no, this is going to be sentimental. I don't need any more of this. And then I called you back after reading it. I was very moved by it because it did begin to lay hands and embody the Shoah from a point of view that I had never experienced before. And it is, it does have its own, it's liturgy, it's also cantata, it's participatory theater. I could see it staged in the round, for me, would be better than it being staged from a bima down to, in a certain ironic way, I want to get away from the German synagogue, right? I mean, the notion of the German synagogue is what, all the Reformed temples in the world are trying to be German Protestants or something, so that we need to get away from that model of how we interact with each other. And again, whether it's the shul, I don't so much like the division of men and women, but the Seder table always to me was a model, because a service was being held, people really enjoyed it, we looked forward to it, and yet a profound story was told, and this is the beginning of that.
I think a final thing that I thought we could end with is just the way in which this really is a multivocal text. To what extent does it really allow for true individual sort of participation and addition to the text? I was struck in some of the comments that both of you made about the difference between a museum and going through a ritual like Nightwords. One, in interaction with the museum, one is an individual. In interaction with Nightwords, one is doing it in a group, even as one is having the internal experience in an individual and diverse way. And I think it's really quite interesting to think about how it is a sort of an act of collective activity, while at the same time being very individualistic, and even in its construction, very multivocal, that is, across the generations of Jewish text, and also in the different characters that one can enter into in enacting Nightwords.
I think what you've said is exactly how it ought to be when things work right, whether it's at the Seder table, old ritual, which we should remember was once new, or Nightwords, which is new ritual, which I deeply believe will one day be old. And I think it does precisely, Sherry, what you're saying. It demands community, but it understands that healthy community never suppresses individual integrity or experience. And at its best, it seems to me, it allows you to really erase the lines that so often divide us as individuals and yet it does it while surfacing the best and deepest parts of who only you can be. So in some sense, it begins here with 36 characters, and for me powerfully invites an infinite number of characters. How do you locate yourself? It begins here with selections from a very deep and wide tradition, by way of inviting all of us to access all of the traditions, literary, intellectual, and spiritual, that we could draw on to keep constructing new incarnations of this performance, so that the memory of the past never goes away, and that as it's told forward, it has the integrity, the authenticity of our experience in it also.
The following conversation between Rabbi Irving Greenberg, President Emeritus of Klal, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, and Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, current Vice President of Klal, explores the historical and theological implications of the performance of Night Words and the legacy of the Holocaust.
David Roski's Night Words is powerful for many reasons. It provokes significant questions about the nature of memory, performance, and ritual. It also asks the reader, the participant, significant questions of theology, the nature of tradition and its ongoing vitality, and also how we locate our voice within that tradition, especially in light of enormous tragedy. And so we have some time now to explore together those kinds of questions, and one of them that strikes me is particularly significant in this particular work is the fact that although the author, David Roski's, coined the phrase sacred betrayal, in which one undermines a tradition, that this work reminds us that tradition is undermined in a way that in fact doesn't undermine it at all, but in fact guarantees its vitality, and that Night Words itself, in its use of ancient texts in reworked ways, combines remarkable novelty without losing its deep connection to tradition. And there is a profound power in being able to cut that knot between a sense of fidelity to the present and personal integrity, while maintaining deep connection to the tradition from which we come. And I wonder, Yitz, if you could comment on that, because it strikes me that so much of your work has wrestled precisely with how people do that in light of the terrible events that Night Words responds to.
We all experience life in different ways as it goes along, but certain experiences become the shaping events that really transform the way we experience life itself. I mean, the heart of the Jewish religion is an Exodus experience, an experience of liberation. Didn't change the world. After all, slavery went on, oppression went on, Pharaoh went on, or its successor at least went on, but Jewish tradition never saw reality again quite the same way, so that in the end, evil and oppression became the deviation, and the inner conviction that you have to live life in light of the truth that just as the Jews were liberated, someday the whole world will be liberated. I give this analogy because, in a sense, throughout the history, that's how the tradition has operated. Certain events were so powerful, so devastating, so exhilarating, that they reformulated the way you saw the world and the way you saw life. And the Holocaust clearly is another one of these events. It may be anti-liberation, it may be anti-life, but it is so powerful that you can't see life ever quite the same way again. And that's what's so powerful about Night Words. It's not creative betrayal at all. It's the integrity of the experience. If you want to pray and say loving God or the God who liberates, but if you say it as if nothing has changed, when you've just gone through the most incredible experience of abandonment and destruction and victory for evil, then either you're making empty words out of these words, you're saying words of liberation as if there was never the pain of the death and destruction,
It's as if you don't take either prayer seriously or the word seriously or the event seriously. What night words, therefore, is in a sense taking classic texts or taking classic Jewish experiences, which have been literally put through a fire, put through the fire of Auschwitz, put through pain and suffering. And so they come out. Now, yes, if you look at from what was said before, you could argue this is a betrayal. This is not the upholding of the God of liberation or the God of guaranteed love of the Jewish people, guaranteed savior of the Jewish people. But if you look more deeply, there could be no more integrity. God could ask for no more integrity and to tell it like it is. That I can say those words again, but I can only say them with anger. I can only say them with parody. I can only say them with some recognition that there's a huge gap between their past credibility and their present credibility. And that's the courage and the greatness of night words, it seems to me, is that he had the honesty and the integrity to put that forward. And it's the same thing about his comment about anger. He speaks of Yom HaShoah as a day of sanctioned anger against God, a sanctioned rage against God, because Judaism has a religion in which you have a day for celebration, a day for satire, Purim, and you have a day for sadness and heartbreak and Tisha B'Av and so on. But he said, where is the day of sanctioned rage? And what he has done here is give us a text that has enormous rage at the world which has done this, rage at the God who made it possible. But that's the rage of white-hot love and relationship. If I wouldn't expect so much, if I wouldn't feel so deeply, I wouldn't be so angry at this moment. So here again, is it rage or is it love? Is it anger or is it in fact the reaffirmation of relationship?
Well, I think what's critical, it seems to me, is exactly that can't be split. And in a healthy relationship and in a vital tradition, those are inseparable. So in fact, I would love to be able to say that it's not only sanctioned rage, but that it's sacred rage. And that in fact any God worth believing in is precisely that God at whom I can rage. And any tradition which can make claims on me, in light of the horrors that life often carries, and it can still make claims on me, has to be a tradition that I can rage at, and be in conversation with, and wrestle with, and struggle with, and that in fact the one given is not the received form of the tradition. The givenness is that we'll always be in that relationship together. And so as much as it's about rage, it strikes me that it's also a remarkably hopeful piece. Because by all rights, we could have put the relationship down. And the fact that we would engage in this kind of sacred rage and parody, it seems to me that's the greatest testament to the unbreakability of the relationship. And it's so odd to me because we talk about tradition as if the tradition is what's unbreakable, as opposed to a tradition of unbreakability. And it's odd to me how we got into that bind, because in fact at the moment we could have made the tradition very, very big, and I think this is an example of doing precisely that, making it so big that we can find our voice in it, even when it's a complex or an angry or a bitter voice. But it's on the inside. It's not a choice of accepting what has been handed to you or walking away, but in fact stepping up and taking responsibility. Because what that tradition is and what the relationship will be is ultimately up to the partners. And so I guess it strikes me as hopeful in that way too, because it really validates our role as partners in the relationship. It says that we have a right to constantly renegotiate. And it seems to me once you have the right to renegotiate, you have an obligation to renegotiate.
That's really very much to the point. And, I've often thought, I'm glad Roskies did this when he was young. When you're young, you don't know your own limitations. It's really an outpouring with tremendous integrity and power. Because again, typically people feel just that. You have to uphold the tradition. There's this classic Talmud, which in fact, Talmudic passage, which in fact Roskies quotes in Night Words, in which the Talmud says that the greatest praise of God, that God is Kel HaGadol HaGibor VaNora, the great, mighty, and awesome God, which is, of course, the opening and the centerpiece of the central prayer, the Amidah, the silent Shemona Esrei prayer of the tradition. This greatest praise, the Talmud playing on verses in Jeremiah and Daniel, points out that Jeremiah omitted omitted the mighty, even as Daniel omitted the idea of God being awesome, and says very bluntly, the reason that he omitted it is because how can you speak of God's might when God's temple is destroyed, when the Babylonians have torn his people apart and destroyed his holy temple? And again, Daniel says, how can you speak of God's awesomeness when all this evil is triumphant and suffering and innocent suffering prevalent? And the Talmud goes back and says, no, the rabbis restored the full praise of God. We now say the great, mighty, and awesome God. But the meaning is totally different. God is mighty not because this is the God who smashed the Egyptians and saved the slaves and drowned the Egyptian army. This is the God whose might is shown in self-restraint, that even when evil and good fight, this God allows human freedom. And this is the God whose awesomeness is shown that this Jewish people, which is one sheep among 70 wolves, somehow manages to survive. This is the hidden force of the awesome God who keeps them alive. I've always been moved by this because, to begin with, the Talmud says, in effect, after this destruction, the very same words we say are totally transformed. Otherwise, we couldn't say them. And then the Talmud comes back and says, well, if so, we understand why the rabbis restored it, but why didn't Jeremiah or Daniel say it in the first place? To which the Talmud answers, because they knew that God wants the truth, and they couldn't bring themselves to lie. So if you talk about sacred parody, or you speak about anger, what could be more classic than the statement, it would have been a lie to say the praises of God as they had been said in the most central text of the Torah itself. It would be a lie in the face of that destruction to say the old words of praise. And you couldn't say them again ever unless, as I believe Brodsky's does in Night Words, you reversed their meaning or redirected them to express that anger, that disappointment, that anguish that you were living through in that relationship. So this is, in effect, the most central liturgical challenge of all. Can you have a prayer that expresses failure and rejection and anger? Can you have a testament of faith that admits the serious questions whether one has a right to believe after these events? Well, that's what Night Words really is.
Right. I mean, I think it's actually an example of, can you have a liturgy that doesn't do that? Can you have a faith that doesn't allow that? That in fact the prayer that takes the knocks, the God who's willing to be on the hook, is in fact the most credible one present. And that in fact what's interesting to me is, in that Talmudic passage, what allows the rabbis not to be liars for having said it? They have great respect for the prophets who said, enough, we're not prepared to say these words, and they fully understood the sacredness of that move. And then they make the move, the very rabbis who will obligate the recitation of those words, will obligate it. And I think it's not only because they reverse the meaning, because we know from our own experience that the reversal of meaning may or may not be known to the next generation that remains obligated by those words. But what the prophets who wouldn't say those words, and the rabbis who insisted on saying those words, it seems to me shared, was the element of choice. Each understood that in their moment, in their era, the real determiner of integrity would be, will I make a choice consciously? And that in fact, whether I choose to or choose not to, what is shareable across that chasm is that each is making a conscious choice, a principled choice, a caring choice. And it seems to me that that, in fact, is the real truth that holds those positions together. That's the real truth that makes the no prayer and the old prayer and the new prayer, if all chosen in that way, equally true. It makes the old tradition, whatever that is, and the new tradition, whatever that is, equally true, if chosen that way. And what's most powerful to me is that the generation of rabbis most aggressively committed to the choosing, to the constructing, to the building in light of the truths of their moment, We're absolutely unashamed of saying that when you have the privilege and the courage and the freedom to be a chooser, you also carry the burden of obligation. And so it seems to me that precisely what we think will come to loggerheads in a tradition or a community or a moment in history or a liturgy or a ritual, choice and obligation in fact nurture each other. That precisely what we think will battle each other, the untouchable God and the damaged God, nurture each other and restore each other's credibility. And so often in these cases, it seems to me, and in this way, Night Words is an example and a challenge and an invitation, I believe, for all of us to break those false dichotomies between choice and tradition, between perfect God and damaged God, and really to bear responsibility for the choices we make and the actions that we take that can make either of those kinds of decisions, any of those kinds of decisions, deeply, deeply true.
It's a wonderful point. In fact, one of the examples, again, of Nightword's ability is simply to abolish this old-new distinction, which again, is just so obvious that most people think if it's an old prayer, it's got more sanctity or more patina, or whatever it is, than a new prayer. And this, Nightword uses old prayers with tremendous force. I mean, the ending where Kaddish, I can't think of none of us can think of a prayer more laden with all the emotion and power of, this is what you say for the past. I mean, this is what you say for the dead, rather, the Kaddish, and this is the classic prayer for the dead. And yet, in taking up this classic prayer, number one is that very prayer itself, he inserts, as you say, as a kind of a counterpoint, as a sacred parody, as an act of sanctioned rage, as an act of counter-testimony, the names of all the places where Jews were killed and murdered and so on, which in a way is at that very moment contradicting the message of the Kaddish, which is a prayer for the dead, but is saying God's name will be great and God's word will be perfected. And here's this counter voice. So he feels very comfortable not only using a classic ancient prayer, but simultaneously attacking it and reformulating it even as he uses it, but simultaneously and without hesitation, literally writes new prayers or new rituals. And one would be hard-pressed to say which is new or which is old. He has this ritual of numbers. I felt this is perhaps the most gutsy and shocking ritual act in the whole Night Words. He takes a set of numbers from a day at Auschwitz where a group of prisoners, and sequentially numbered, were put to death, and has the first person, the Chazan, write this number and then write it on the next person's skin, and the next person writes it on the next person's skin. So you have a series of sequential numbers in which literally one is making up a new ritual. There's no precedent for it, in which the numbers of Auschwitz, the numbers that were used to deny the humanity of people because you're numbers, you're things, you're not people anymore. The numbers that were applied before they were used up and then gassed and gotten rid of. You apply this to fat, healthy, well taken care of contemporary Jews, to turn that into a ritual, the ritual of writing and inscribing on my flesh, just as the classic tradition plants the covenant on our flesh with circumcision. Here you're writing the number on our flesh as if it is now written on our body. And you walk this very thin line. It could have easily be dismissed as, how dare you, you're well fed, you're well taken care of, even put this number down. And we're a number that was written by people who were tortured, emaciated, starved, beaten. And how dare you place yourself in any analogical situation as if you have a right to compare yourself. So my first point is it's a new ritual, but it's got extraordinary force. And I can't think of such other imaginative moments that really force you, as it were, into this reality, into coming front. And then just when you're ready to say, but this is outrageous, I have no right to put yourself in it, you stop and you realize that the classic text of the Haggadah insists that in every generation, a Jew must act as if this person, I, came out of Egypt. And if one is in any sense acting out this tradition, that means that the day must come when every Jew feels as if I was in Auschwitz. And as outrageous and as impossible it is, that's the heart of Jewish memory. It's the power to transform your life, to force you into a whole new way of seeing the world, to force you to take a moral responsibility that you don't want to take otherwise, and that he's managed to do this. And 100 years now, it'll have the same patina. But at this moment, to have written it fresh, and it's simply seamless. One can't tell the difference. This is some ancient ritual, or again, he has the ritual where he again plays this classic dialectic of past and present. He calls it the ritual of chalitza, taking off the shoes. The classic one, of course, was when the brother of the husband who died without children refused to take responsibility to carry on the family name and take care of the wife. His shoe was removed and literally spat into as a kind of a statement. His face spat into as a kind of a statement of failure to take responsibility. But here it becomes the reenactment of the removal of the shoes from so many hundreds of thousands of people in the camps. And it is the act of taking responsibility. So there's this amazing capacity to create new rituals that have as much power, as much sacredness, as much demand upon us as anything inherited. And at the same time, they can be totally new, or they can be drawn straight from some classic tradition. So which is old and which is new, and the two are inseparable. And the truth is that all history is the present moment. And what happened 50 years ago and 5,000 years ago is happening at this moment, and I'm entering into it.
I think that inseparability of past, present, and future is the deepest testimony to an infinite tradition. And in fact, the only thing that I imagine outstrips the absurdity of ki'ilu, of as if, is the necessity for it. I imagine when the first rabbis got together around a Seder table, before there was such a thing as a Seder, and they sat in the presence of parents and grandparents who had eaten the sacrifices of a now burned and broken temple. Eat this matzah and drink this wine, and it will be as if you have left Egypt. That there were those who said, "How dare you?" to use your expression, "How dare you? I ate of the real Passover, the real thing, the sacrifice. And you're offering this? You're offering condiments when the main course has been stripped from us?" And of course, the real truth there is that in that daring as-ifness, they create the single most widely observed ritual the Jewish people has today. And I think when you talk about the marking of the numbers, the image that always floats in front of me is that the numbers were inscribed on bodies, and the bodies vanished, and the numbers were left hanging there. And now we come and reattach our bodies to those numbers. And that I know those lives that vanished. But I also know we revivify them in some way. We give vitality to them in some way. Not only by bearing the numbers, but even in the courage to tell their stories, and to allow our voices to carry their stories, and not feel that we're dishonoring their memory, but in fact carrying their memory, knowing full well that as we tell it, we will change it. There's no way to escape that truth. Much as there was no way to escape the truth that Passover after a Paschal sacrifice is no longer possible, is different, and yet in its difference is the guarantee of its future. And so I'm struck by the readiness here to invite people to add their voices to this story, and to consider what it would look like if we had the courage across the board as Jews in particular, but as human beings confronting any tragedy, to find and add our own voices as a way of guaranteeing that that memory continues and that it doesn't undermine the past. That quite the opposite, it guarantees that the past will have a future.
You just sung a hymn of celebration, and I really believe one should, to this generation, because it's very courageous. I mean, in a way, when you stand at Sinai and a thundering voice comes down, and it's, as only Cecil B. DeMille could arrange it. I mean, standing at Sinai in this overwhelming sense, well, of course, you kind of yield and you accept it. In fact, the Talmud many years later speculated that it's like coercion, because when you've gone through those kind of miracles, you're standing in the desert, and God is roaring forth in this overwhelming voice. Well, of course you accept it. It's a kind of yielding to force majeure. But here, in our very time, God's voice is hidden. The sense of loss is palpable, and yet it takes a tremendous courage. You spoke before about choice. But here's the people choosing, A, to carry on, B, to accept this revelation, which they can't hide behind it. This revelation comes, untouched by human hands, and it's roaring down from heaven. No, this is a revelation that we discover that comes in our voices, that comes in the voices of children and the voices of diaries and in the voices of poets, and none of which officially, at least, are God's spokesman. To have the courage to affirm that, to take it on and repeat it. I always say, I grew up in that yeshiva world in which the generation that accepted Torah Sinai, they must be superhuman, because they stood at Sinai. But I honestly feel that our generation, which has had a much more hidden, much more muffled, much more contradicted revelation, and has had the courage to take it on and to now take on the night words. To, first of all, the courage to write it, put it together, and then the courage to say it and to participate and to accept this as the revelation of our time. It takes a grandeur of spirit. I feel it is, in a way, again, it breaks the old simple dichotomies between the authority of the past and the right of the present. The Talmud says at one point that what the future disciple, true and tried and true disciple will discover, will innovate. Centuries, millennium later, was revealed to Moses at Sinai. What it's trying to say is that the choice, the insight, the acceptance of revelation of this generation is as great as Sinai, and it constitutes another Sinai in our lifetime. And that's what it's about. Now, this Sinai is particularly stunning because it comes out of an anti-Sinai. It comes out of a reality of evil triumphant and mass murder and degradation and cheapening of the value of the image of God, which is the most infinitely valuable thing in the world, according to tradition. So to have had the strength and the courage to see that after the degradation and after the destruction, and in it, there is still an affirmation, there's still a great quality of dignity and value and hope and faith that these people exhibit and that we do in walking in their footsteps. I think it makes you feel, as I said, that this is a generation that deserves to be celebrated. If it weren't such a tragic event, I would make the celebration, but obviously I don't want to sound either complacent or triumphant. The remarkable thing about this generation is that out of the anger and out of the compassion and out of, I remember how much strength it took years later when I sort of accepted the fact that God is suffering means I shouldn't be afraid to use that language, even though I'd always been afraid that that's Christian language and as a Jew I should avoid it. But I came to feel that this, I believe strongly, that this new relationship can only be a loving one because I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid of the God who punishes, because that doesn't work theologically after the Holocaust. I'm not doing it because of the God who's going to step in and save me when I'm in trouble in a way that is no longer the easy way to say it. So then why would people turn to this renewed relationship? The only choice is out of love, out of compassion, out of shared suffering, out of a sense of that the old dream that unites humans and God, the dream of perfecting the world, is still worth going on with. So I feel in many ways this is a generation which is not only writing a new prayer, but writing a new relationship. And it's a relationship much more equal, much more dignified. And therefore, and why would you enter in such a relationship when you feel equal, dignified, not dependent, not looking for help, not looking for a payoff? So the answer is, honestly, it's love. It's pure relationship. It's out of a real sense of adequacy. And yet even then, in my adequacy, I turn to the God who sustains and who shares, and I sustain, even as God sustains me. So I think that too is implicit in Night Words. It's a start. It's an expression of this emerging new relationship, which will express itself in old and new prayers and in old and renewed love.
Well, I think then as we close, the prayer that I would add to Roski's prayer, and I think we can both say, is the prayer that in this generation we have both the courage to feel the authority of the past, both when it is painful and when it is glorious, and also the courage to create what will be the past for the generations that are yet to come.